Somebody in your group just died. There's no funeral home to call, no refrigerated morgue, no legal requirement dictating what happens next, and within a matter of hours, a body left exposed in the open air is going to become a serious, practical problem, attracting scavengers, spreading disease, and forcing every single person in your small band to confront, directly and physically, exactly what happens to a human body once the person who inhabited it is gone. What do you actually do? And here's the genuinely fascinating part of the answer. Depending on which ancient human population you were part of, which specific millennium, which specific landscape you happen to be living in, the answer humans arrived at varied so dramatically that some of the solutions would seem completely alien to each other, despite all of them, in their own way, being trying to solve exactly the same brutal practical and emotional problem. We've talked before on this channel about whether ancient humans understood death conceptually, the philosophical and psychological side of this question. This video is going somewhere more physical, more practical, and honestly somewhat more unsettling. What did they actually do with the body itself, mechanically, physically, across the enormous range of solutions our species developed? And what does the sheer diversity of those solutions tell us about how differently humans have related to their own dead across time and place? Let's start with the simplest, most immediately practical option, because it's likely the oldest, and it requires understanding something genuinely important about what a dead body actually does if nothing is done to it at all. Decomposition begins essentially immediately after death, and within days, depending on climate and temperature, a body becomes a significant health hazard, attracting insects, generating powerful odor, and in many environments, actively drawing dangerous scavenging predators directly toward a living camp. This alone gives you the most basic, universal starting motivation behind virtually every body disposal practice that followed across human history. Get the body away from the living, one way or another, and do it relatively quickly. The earliest and simplest solution, likely predating anything resembling deliberate ritual, was almost certainly straightforward removal, carrying or dragging a body some distance from camp and leaving it exposed to the elements and scavengers, a practice archaeologists sometimes call simple abandonment or excarnation when it becomes more deliberate and structured rather than purely practical. Excarnation itself, the deliberate exposure of a body to the elements, insects, and scavenging animals specifically to strip flesh from bone rather than simply discarding the body, developed into a genuinely sophisticated and, in several documented cultures, deeply meaningful practice rather than a crude afterthought. Sky burial, still practiced today in parts of Tibet and among certain Zoroastrian communities historically through what's called dogma or towers of silence, involves deliberately placing a body on an elevated platform or exposed site specifically for vultures and other scavenging birds to consume the flesh. Far from being a grim last resort, in Tibetan Buddhist tradition specifically, sky burial connects directly to core religious beliefs about the impermanence of the physical body and the importance of a final act of generosity, offering one's remains to sustain other living creatures rather than treating the corpse as something requiring permanent preservation or protection from the natural world. Zoroastrian towers of silence operated under a related but distinct religious logic, rooted in the belief that a corpse is spiritually impure and that earth, fire, and water, all considered sacred elements, must never be contaminated by direct contact with the dead, making exposure to scavenging birds on an elevated structure the only method consistent with protecting those sacred elements from pollution. Cremation represents a genuinely different technological and conceptual approach, and the archaeological evidence for it stretches back considerably further than many people assume. Some of the earliest confirmed cremation evidence comes from a site in Australia, the Lake Mungo remains, with cremated human remains dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, representing an extraordinarily early and sophisticated deliberate use of fire specifically for body disposal, requiring not just fire itself, already a well-established human technology by that point, but the specific knowledge and sustained effort needed to generate and maintain a fire hot enough and long enough to actually cremate human remains rather than simply burn the body's exterior. Cremation subsequently became deeply significant across an enormous range of documented ancient cultures, from the Bronze Age cultures of prehistoric Europe, where cremated remains are frequently found deposited in ceramic urns within formal burial mounds, to ancient Hindu tradition, where cremation, specifically performed at the edge of a sacred river when possible, remains connected to deeply held religious beliefs about liberating the soul from the physical body to allow reincarnation or spiritual release, a practice with a documented history stretching back well over 3,000 years and continuing essentially unbroken into the present day. Now let's talk about mummification, because it represents almost the philosophical opposite of both excarnation and cremation, an approach specifically obsessed with preserving the physical body rather than returning it to the elements or eliminating it entirely. And the reasoning behind that opposite approach reveals something genuinely important about how differently ancient cultures conceptualize the relationship between body and soul. Ancient Egyptian mummification, the most famous example by far, developed over centuries into an extraordinarily sophisticated technical process, involving removal of internal organs prone to rapid decomposition, specifically preserving several of them separately in canopic jars, treatment of the body with natron, a naturally occurring salt compound that draws out moisture and inhibits bacterial decay, and careful wrapping in many layers of linen, all driven by a specific religious belief that the physical body needed to remain intact and recognizable in order for the soul to successfully navigate the afterlife and eventually reunite with it. This wasn't simply about preservation for its own sake. It was a technically demanding, resource-intensive practice specifically because ancient Egyptian religious belief held that the physical body's survival was directly, causally connected to the soul's survival and continued existence after death, making mummification a genuinely urgent spiritual necessity rather than an optional embellishment. Egyptian mummification wasn't remotely unique in the broader historical record either, which is worth emphasizing directly, because independent mummification traditions developed separately across multiple, geographically disconnected cultures with no possibility of learning the technique from each other. The Chinchorro culture of what's now coastal Chile and Peru developed deliberate mummification practices predating ancient Egyptian mummification by roughly 2,000 years, with the earliest confirmed Chinchorro mummies dating back over 7,000 years, involving a technically complex process of removing organs, treating the body with ash and clay, and reconstructing the body's shape around an internal frame, representing an entirely independent invention of sophisticated preservation. Technology arrived at through completely separate cultural and religious reasoning than the ancient Egyptians ever had access to. Let's address something genuinely uncomfortable directly, because an honest, complete account of this topic requires it, and that's the archaeological evidence for mortuary cannibalism, the deliberate consumption of human remains as part of funerary practice rather than for survival or aggression. This is a genuinely sensitive area of archaeological interpretation, and researchers are careful to distinguish it clearly from survival cannibalism during famine or warfare, which is an entirely different phenomenon driven by desperate circumstance rather than cultural or spiritual belief. Anthropologists have documented multiple historical and ethnographically observed cultures where consuming a portion of a deceased relative's remains was understood as an act of honor, love, and continuity, a way of literally incorporating a departed family member back into the living community rather than abandoning them entirely to the earth or the fire. The Fore people of Papua New Guinea, studied extensively in the mid-20th century, practiced a form of mortuary cannibalism specifically tied to funerary respect for deceased relatives, a practice that tragically became linked to the transmission of a fatal neurological disease called kuru, caused by misfolded proteins called prion present in the brain tissue of the deceased, ultimately motivating researchers, including Daniel Carlton Gajdusek, whose work on kuru contributed to a Nobel Prize, to study the disease directly. Work that meaningfully advanced broader scientific understanding of an entire category of disease now recognized as prion disorders, the same general category that includes conditions like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's genuinely important to state clearly that mortuary cannibalism represents a documented but relatively uncommon practice historically, existing within a much broader spectrum of ancient and traditional mortuary customs, most of which involved none of this at all. There's a final category worth covering, one that connects directly back to something we've discussed previously on this channel regarding ancient burial evidence, secondary burial, and bone processing, practices involving an initial period of body decomposition or excarnation, followed by deliberate later handling, cleaning, and reburial or curation of the bones themselves, sometimes considerably after the initial death. Multiple documented cultures across a wide geographic and historical range practiced formal secondary burial customs, where a body might initially be placed somewhere to decompose or be excarnated, and then, sometimes months or years later, family or community members would return specifically to collect, clean, and ceremonially rebury the bones, often accompanied by significant ritual and community gathering. Some traditional societies in parts of Indonesia and Madagascar historically practiced elaborate secondary burial and reburial ceremonies, sometimes involving literally exhuming and rewrapping ancestral remains periodically as an ongoing, active expression of continued connection to deceased family members, rather than treating a single initial burial as the definitive, final act of separation between the living and the dead. Think about what this genuinely wide range of solutions actually tells you when you look at it all together, because it resists any single, tidy explanation about how humans naturally handle death. Some cultures wanted the body gone as completely and quickly as possible. Some wanted it preserved indefinitely, intact and recognizable. Some wanted it deliberately returned to nature through scavenging animals as an act of spiritual generosity. Some wanted it transformed by fire specifically to liberate something believed to exist separately from the physical remains. And some wanted an ongoing, continuing physical relationship with the bones themselves, revisited and cared for across years rather than treated as a single completed event. None of these approaches is more primitive or more advanced than any other in any meaningful sense. They represent genuinely different, internally coherent belief systems about what a body actually is, what happens to a person after death, and what obligation, if any, the living owe to the physical remains left behind. There's something worth sitting with here as we close this out, because underneath every one of these wildly different practices sits the exact same starting problem every single human community throughout our entire history has had to solve, somehow, one way or another. A person you loved is gone, and their body remains, and something has to be done, and whatever you choose to do carries enormous weight, not because of the physical remains themselves, but because of everything that choice says about what you believe connected you to that person in the first place, and what, if anything, you believe survives once the physical connection is finally, irreversibly severed.